A single mile of graded coral decided the Pacific War, and on the night of 14th of November 1942, the United States Navy lost it. The airstrip was called Henderson Field, cut into the north coast of Guadalcanal by Japanese engineers, and taken unfinished by the 1st Marine Division on 7th August 1942. The Marines named it for Major Lofton Henderson, a dive bomber pilot killed at Midway 2 months earlier, and then spent 3 months learning that the field was not a position on the island, it was the island. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Everything either side did was measured against a single question: could aircraft fly from that runway tomorrow morning? The planes that operated from it, the ragged, malarial, perpetually undermanned collection of Marine, Navy, and Army squadrons the Marines called the Cactus Air Force, made daylight movement through the channel between the Solomons, prohibitively expensive for Japanese surface ships, so Japan moved at night. Fast destroyers ran down the slot after dark, unloaded on the beaches, and cleared Ironbottom Sound before dawn brought the dive bombers. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express. It worked, but it imposed a brutal arithmetic on Lieutenant General Hyakutake Harukichi's 17th Army. A destroyer could carry men and rice. It could not carry field artillery, or the shells to feed it, or the trucks to move it. Japan had thousands of soldiers on Guadalcanal and almost nothing to fight with. The obvious answer was to break the airfield. On the night of 13 to 14 October, the battleships Kongo and Haruna stood off the coast and fired 918 14-inch rounds into the Lunga plain. They burned most of the Cactus Air Force's aviation gasoline and left the runway unusable for roughly 48 hours. Then it recovered. Engineers filled craters with coral and crushed drums. Pilots flew from a strip that looked like a plowed field. Japan learned the wrong lesson from that night, that bombardment was a temporary inconvenience. In November they returned to try again, with a battleship, corrected fire, and a division waiting offshore. The Battle of Guadalcanal was fought in 2 actions, 3 nights apart. On 12 to 13 November, Rear Admirals Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott took a cruiser force into a point-blank brawl and were both killed. The battleship Hie staggered out crippled and was scuttled the next day. It bought 2 days. Vice Admiral William Halsey, who had relieved Robert Gormley as South Pacific Commander on 18 October, then did something no American commander had done in the Pacific. He committed battleships to a night surface action. Rear Admiral Willis Lee took Washington and South Dakota, north of Savo Island, on the night of 14 November. Lee was among the very few American flag officers who genuinely understood surface search radar and what it could do in the dark. In this timeline, the radar picket loses contact. There is no dramatic failure, no single catastrophic error, only an intermittent return, a misidentified pip, a plot that never resolves into a target. Vice Admiral Kondo Nobutake's bombardment force slips around the western side of Savo and into the Sound unengaged. Lee never fires his 16-inch guns. South Dakota's electrical cascade, the failure that historically blinded her radar and left her spotlit and hammered, happens when nobody sees it, a footnote in an action report about a night that ended without contact. Kirishima was a Kongo-class battlecruiser rebuilt into a fast battleship, mounting 8 14-inch guns. Her magazines were stocked with Type 3 incendiary shells designed for exactly this and useless for fighting other ships. She opened fire shortly after midnight. Unlike October, spotters ashore infiltrated forward over the preceding days, corrected the fall of shot by radio. She walked her fire down the runway, then across the fuel farm, then through the revetments. She fired until her magazines ran low. At dawn, the Cactus Air Force was a line of burned airframes, and Henderson Field was a crater field with no gasoline to fly from. Tanaka Raizo brought 11 transports into Tassafaronga against no air opposition at all and put the 38th Division ashore, intact, with its artillery. Major General Alexander Vandegrift's Marines did not lose Guadalcanal. That should be said plainly, because everything that followed would obscure it. By November, the 1st Marine Division was 4 months into a campaign it had entered with an incomplete supply train. Malaria and dysentery had thinned every rifle company. Through September, the men had eaten captured Japanese rice. They had held the Lunga perimeter against everything Hyakutake could push through the jungle, and they had held it because Japanese artillery arrived one gun at a time on a destroyer's fantail. That constraint was gone. The 38th Division came ashore with its guns, and for the first time, the Japanese could shell the perimeter systematically rather than raid it. The Marines could not answer the bombardment and could not disperse from it. The perimeter was too small. Halsey tried to run supply and evacuation by fast destroyer transport, as the Japanese had. But the Tokyo Express had always worked because Japanese ships arrived where American aircraft could not reach them by dawn. Now, the reverse held. Aircraft from Rabaul and Buin found the destroyers in daylight, and each attempt cost ships to deliver tonnages that a single freighter would have carried. Ammunition on the perimeter was counted, then rationed, then counted again. Nimitz's staff at Pearl Harbor understood the shape of it within a week. The consequences of what they concluded would prove catastrophic, but first they had to say it out loud. Evacuation began in the last days of December and was never going to be enough. Destroyers lifted the wounded and a fraction of the division from beaches under fire. Some ships were sunk making the attempt. On the perimeter, what remained ran out of ammunition before it ran out of men. Vandergrift's capitulation was transmitted, acknowledged, and then not announced for 4 days. The number of Americans passing into Japanese captivity was the largest since Corregidor surrendered on 6 May 1942, the largest since Bataan on 9th of April, when roughly 76,000 Americans and Filipinos had marched into a captivity. Most of them did not survive. Those were losses inherited from a peacetime army caught in a colony it could not reinforce. Guadalcanal was different. Guadalcanal was the offensive. It was the operation the American public had been told in headlines since August that the Marines were winning. The failure was not on the perimeter. The failure was at sea on one night in November, and no communique in Washington could make the arithmetic read otherwise. Admiral Ernest King had made the Solomons offensive his project, pushed through against a strategy that was formally and unambiguously Germany first. Operation Torch had landed in North Africa on 8 November. The Germans were still fighting inside Stalingrad. King had argued that the Pacific could not simply be held, that an offensive posture was cheaper than a defensive one. Now he defended Chester Nimitz, appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet on the last day of 1941, in a room that had wanted this outcome as an argument. General Marshall and the Army staff did not say that Nimitz should be relieved. They said something more damaging, that the loss demonstrated the offensive had been premature, undertaken with insufficient shipping and inadequate air cover, and that the Pacific should be shut down to a defensive line until Germany was beaten. Roosevelt kept Nimitz. Relieving him would have conceded the point. But the Joint Chiefs suspended further advances in the Solomons, and in the suspension the Army won everything it had asked for without ever having to fire the man. Japan spent 1943 doing what Japan had been unable to do in 1942, building. Henderson Field was repaired by Japanese engineers and extended. Airstrips went up in the Russell Islands. The Southern Solomons became a consolidated position rather than a contested one, and Japanese search aircraft ranged south toward the New Hebrides, where the American base at Espiritu Santo now sat at the end of a line rather than behind one. For the first time since Midway, the American position in the South Pacific was defensive. Convoys to Australia were rerouted. Halsey, who had been given the South Pacific to attack with, spent the year covering. It should be said clearly what this did not do. It did not put Japan in reach of winning the war. The shipyards on the American coasts were already laying down the hulls that would decide it, and no arrangement of islands changes that arithmetic. What the divergence changed was the schedule and the price. And then came the moment that made both of those things a political question rather than a military one. The newspapers that had carried the Marines' story since August now carried the surrender of a Marine division. Isolationist voices that had gone silent on the morning of 7 December 1941 found, in early 1943, a way to speak again. They did not defend Japan. They argued arithmetic, that the Pacific was an ocean, that every island would cost what this one had cost, that the war in Europe was the war that mattered, and that a settlement recognizing Japan's position in the Western Pacific was the honest answer to a question the administration would not ask honestly. It was not a majority position. It was a position printed in newspapers, spoken on the floor of the Senate, and answered by an administration that now had to argue for a war it had assumed was self-evident. Roosevelt held the line. He held it by insisting on unconditional surrender in language more absolute than the strategic situation warranted, because the alternative was to concede that a runway on Guadalcanal had been worth negotiating over. The campaign to retake the Solomons began 18 months late, from a worse starting line against airfields and coastal batteries that Japan had been given a year to build. The men who took Guadalcanal back in 1944 fought for ground the Marines had held in 1942 with rice and quinine and nothing else, and they paid for it at rates that had no counterpart in the real history. Everything downstream slid: the timetable, the casualty lists, the estimate of what an invasion of the home islands would require. None of it changed the outcome. It changed how long and how many, and it turned on a radar contact. A pip on a screen aboard a picket ship north of Savo Island, held or lost in the space of a few minutes on a dark night, with nobody aboard aware that they were deciding anything at all. In the real history, Lee's plot held. Washington's SG radar found Kirishima in the dark. Her 16-inch guns put roughly 9 hits into the Japanese battleship in 7 minutes, and she was scuttled the next morning northwest of Savo. Tanaka's transports were broken up. 4 beached hulls at Tassafaronga landed some 2,000 men and 260 cases of ammunition, and the 38th Division ceased to exist as a fighting formation before it ever fought. The Marines held the field. The schedule of the Pacific War rested on that, and on nothing more substantial than one man's understanding of what a radar screen was telling him.